Professor of Geosciences and Joint Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He has spent a majority of his career investigating the paleoclimate context of human evolution. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Cohen.
Thanks, Joe. And I have the unenviable task of entertaining you after hopefully enough alcohol. So I'll give it a go. So I'm actually going to talk about, although I am very interested in, I'm going to talk a little bit about paleoclimate and human evolution, but I want to talk more broadly about the things that we can learn about ecosystems in general. I'm a paleoecologist by training. And so I'll just start by the standard acknowledgement. The work that I'm going to tell you about is the result of many, well over 200 people's work. So I can't claim credit for it. I've just listed a few of my close colleagues here, people that I've collaborated with on a number of the drilling projects that I've been involved in, and I'll tell you about particularly the Lake Malawi drilling project and the Hominin sites and Paleolakes drilling project. And you heard about LACCOR earlier, the fantastic facility at the University of Minnesota, where it's basically a core museum where many of us keep our store our cores that have been taken over the years. So what I want to do is do a little choir preaching, tell you about why we need cores, long records, paleontological records from lakes. I'm sure that most of you don't need convincing about this on the millennial scale, but I want to try to convince you that we need to go back even further in time, and these fantastic lakes in East African Rift Valley are a great place to do that. I'll talk a little bit about what's been accomplished and where we've done this work, with particular emphasis on the Lake Malawi project results and the results from the Hominin sites drilling project, and look forward towards new adventures in the future. I want to talk some about the questions in ecology and evolution that I think these cores can address with case studies from these lakes, and then a little bit about our plans for what we'd like to do going forward. So this is the preaching to the choir part. I think that what we've learned over the last few years, like lakes in the Arctic and in Maine and pretty much everywhere you look around the world, lakes are harbingers of environmental change. In East Africa, where I've worked at Lake Tanganyika for many years, the largest of the African Rift Lakes, this lake is changing rapidly as a result of different kinds of forcing phenomena related to global warming, where these lakes, which are meromictic and permanently stratified, are becoming even more strongly so. And that's having a profound effect as the lake has warmed on the fishery from this lake, which is a fishery the size of the fishery, was the size of the fishery of New England in a single lake. So 60% of the animal protein for the people in Central Africa was coming from fish, and much of it coming from this lake and a few others in the region. That fishery has declined dramatically over the last few years. And when we go back and look at paleo records, we can see, this is the 20th century, really stands out, not just in terms of being warmer, but in terms of biogenic silica production, in terms of fish fossils. We know that the environment is changing rapidly, and it's not just a result of overfishing, it's a result of climate change and climate variability. So paleo records play an important role in this, but these lakes are entering states that we can't really understand just in reference to what's happened in the Holocene. We have to go back further in time. And for the last almost 30 years, I've been involved in drilling lakes because I want to know something about records that can take us back further in time than we could get from a Livingston piston core tossed over the side of a boat. And we've become pretty good at this in different places in the world. I'll talk about Lake Malawi. This is actually the original GLAD rig that I was fortunate enough to be a co-PI on the development of the global lake drilling system, the RV carried helps. And here's kind of maybe the state of the art in terms of depth records from Lake Ohrid in Macedonia. There's the Burj Al Sharif. I'm probably butchering the name of the world's tallest building. So we've gotten pretty good at collecting long cores from various parts of the world, including in Africa. And people have been thinking about this for a long time as places where we could get long, continuous historical experiments that would avoid, if we want to ask questions about going back millions of years, the weathering problems that are associated with outcrops. And in many places, this is the only way to get a core. So to me, as a paleoecologist, there's some really interesting questions that can be asked about these lakes. The tempo of ecosystem change through long-term shifts in climate. And I'll give you some examples from the Lake Malawi drilling project about that, and both these mega droughts that we published on and responses to the Toba super-eruption. The environmental context and hypothesis testing for human evolution, because we're working in Africa over the last few million years, the time frame of human origins. And then looking forward, constraining phylogenetic histories of these fantastic species flocks that are found endemic in these lakes. So, and of course, the applied aspect of implications for understanding modern change. So just getting into this first question, what are the long-term tempos of lake ecosystem change, and how do they respond to these extraordinary environmental perturbations, perhaps similar to the ones that we can expect in the future in Africa, not just of temperature rise, but also huge hydrological changes. This is the drilling rig at Lake Malawi. Here it is assembled on the barge that we used. And so you can't bring the JOIDES resolution into the middle of Africa, unfortunately. It would be nice, but we had to build our own. And here it is. This is a 170-foot barge. There was nothing there originally other than that superstructure, and we had to bring all the rest of this stuff in to drill this lake. So Lake Malawi is the second largest of the African Rift Lakes, and it's a very deep lake that lies in the southern subtropics. It's an ancient lake going back 5 million years, although as you'll see, the history has changed a lot over time. And we drilled this in 2005. And I already showed you this, but I have to give you a little anecdote. When we drilled this, because the primary drill site was in 600 meters of water, and although it is possible to anchor a barge in that kind of water depth, it's not terribly practical. So for this project, we decided to take I think, the right advice, and you can see at the four corners of these barge, these big 250 horsepower thruster engines that are talking to computers, that are talking to satellites and lake floor transponders. As a dynamic positioning system like the oceanic drill ships use. But we had to purchase this system. The PIs wanted to rent it, but DOSEC, the organization responsible for scientific drilling on the continents, convinced us, no, we got to buy this because a whole bunch of other projects will use it. Well, after the project ended, it went and sat in a warehouse for 20 years or so. No, well, 15 years or 13 years, something like that, since 2005. And just a couple of years ago, we finally found a buyer for it, and that's our and just about a month or two ago, 2 of these were destroyed when the Super Heavy missed its target and blew up a couple of these on landing. So Elon Musk was our buyer. So anyway, so that was kind of fun. So here's the Lake Malawi. We drilled it in 2005 at 2 sites, one in the northern basin in about 350 meters and one the deep site here. We knew from seismic data that had been previously collected, there was this very pronounced unconformity in here. We knew that there was something really environmentally interesting going on since the late 1980s, but we didn't know when that occurred and exactly the magnitude of that event. So here's some core images I'd like to show. So that, again, this is in 600 meters of water, and this is what you'd find there today. Typical microlaminated diatom ooze. Remember, the lake is completely stratified. Is it possible to turn down the lights in here, or is that asking too much? Yeah, it's microlaminated calcium carbonate pore oozes that are deep water. These are, for the most part, annual varves. And then you get down to the core to that seismic horizon, and this is what you see: calcium carbonate nodules, soils, paleosols from marshes, and a over 590 meter lake level fall. So really, really remarkable. This is a record going back about 200,000 years, and you can see there wasn't a single one of these lake level faults, but actually there were multiple ones that went to basically the same kind of level. For the last 80,000 years or so, the lake has been relatively stable. And I want to emphasize this because it was kind of paradigmatic in Africa and paleoclimatology and paleolimnology that the big Kahuna event was drying at the LGM or just after it, around 18,000. And we have some small event here. The lake dropped maybe 50 meters, which would have been seen as a large drop, but that's all we knew about. The drill core doesn't come up to the present, but we have a record from other cores that show us the lake wasn't changing very much. So we knew in that context that Lake Malawi had dropped somewhat during that relatively arid time in Africa. Lake Victoria dried out, but we had no conception of the magnitude of these earlier events. And so, you know, this is maybe how to think about it. This is the modern deep lake, and during these mega drought events, we had something that looked like this. The lake would have been very, very different. I'm an ostracod specialist, and when I look at the fauna, when we ended up only drilling these deep water sites, I was very unhappy because I thought, oh, we're not going to get any benthic invertebrates. The lake's going to be permanently anoxic. I was very happy to see that that wasn't the case, that when you go back to these events, the lake got very shallow. We see a lot of these purple colored ones are these extremely alkaline water species. We see a lot of highly stressed fauna of somewhat deeper water things that would have been growing in this lake when it was a little bit fresher. But by and large, extremely different conditions than the Meromictic stratified lake that has occurred in there for the last 70 or 80,000 years. So there's a period of repeated megadroughts. And we see this not just in the ostracod record, although I'm partial to them. In my lab, we've worked on a lot of other things as well. So I'll just show you a couple of records here. This is Chaeoborus edulis, the phantom midge, which you have in lakes here. It's a large, very juicy, tasty, large zooplankton. And you find it here in New England in fishless lakes. In Africa, members of this genus are diurnal migrators. And what they do is they move up and down in the water column, down into the anoxic zone, which is a refuge from fish. Then they come up to the surface, and you see these things that look like fires out on the lake. That's an emergence of probably billions of these little tiny insects as adults. So they spend 3 or 4 years as larvae in the lake, and then they emerge and they have sex and they die, sink down to form layers of Chaeoborus goo, which are major parts of the sediments. And you see, here's a zone during one of these megadroughts when they're gone. And what's happening is that the lake is losing its stratification, so it's losing its refuge for these invertebrates, and they go away. We see huge changes in the charcoal as well. In the climate, the semi-arid to extremely arid climate during the megadrought times, the environment switches from what we see today, which is semi-humid, about 1 meter of rainfall a year, to something that would actually be very similar to what the climate around my backyard in Tucson, where the problem for maintaining fire isn't that it's too arid, it's that there's not enough fuel load. So you can't maintain a fire where you have discontinuous vegetation. And so charcoal goes to basically 0 or extremely low levels during those periods of time. So what we've learned from that is that this lake has undergone these extraordinary fluctuations going back for the full duration of the Malawi core, some 1.2 or 1.3 million years. These are maybe the most extreme, but there have been repeated episodes of this. And what the lake has done during these alternations of state is it's changed from its modern state. And I want you to keep this picture in mind. This is what Lake Malawi looks like today, with all these, literally 1,000 species of cichlid fish that are grazing on the rocks, very, very low nutrient loads in the surface waters. So all the feeding is taking place in this blue water condition. And that's kind of the state I'm showing here. There are some repetitions of these conditions, notably the last 70,000 years, about 400,000 years ago, and again around 800,000 years ago. Kind of interesting 400,000 year cyclicity in there. But it's alternating with something that would have been much more like Lake Turkana, well-mixed, very eutrophic. I don't have time to show Jeffrey Stone's diatom data, but it's all very consistent with this story. The lake is changing from this green water state into this blue water state. And this, we'll see later, has some important implications for the evolution of these species in the lake. Lest you think it's just the hydrology of the lake, we actually have a really good pollen record that my former PhD student Sarah Ivory's worked on. And it is, there's a lot of variability in the vegetation around the lake today, from afromontane to woodland types of environments. But where we see these big mega droughts, we see shifts to grassland and loss of arboreal pollen. So the story is consistent from the watershed into the lake, that this is clearly a climatically driven alternation of states that is driving not only the lake, but the upland areas around it. Sarah has shown in some of her studies of the pollen that each time the forest contracts during one of these mega droughts, it shrinks down into these riparian areas and comes back pretty much the same assemblage every time. Pretty small clustering of variety in the forest phases. And that's very different than what comes back in the arid phases, which involves a lot of invasion of species from the northeastern Somalian part of Africa. So there's an interesting biogeographic story there as well. Now, we can take these long records and we can query them not just for these trends that go on over millions of years, but we can also take advantage of the power of paleolimnology, the ability to look at short duration events and ask questions about things that went on very short time scales. And I'll just give you an example here from an event that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the super-eruption of Mount Toba in Sumatra that occurred about 75,000 years ago. So a paleoanthropologist about 25 or 30 years ago, when mitochondrial DNA studies of humans were really getting off the ground, recognized that, hey, there was evidence for a human bottleneck in ancestral modern humans in Africa. And hey, there's this big volcanic eruption in Toba 75,000 years ago. About the same time, add 2 and 2 and get 9. You'll come up with a hypothesis. And so the idea was that this big eruption generated a volcanic winter and in Africa. Global cooling that, according to some of the models that were proposed, might have lasted for a decade or even longer, maybe centuries in some scenarios. So the idea, of course, is that in order for this to have had this effect, Africa had to get pretty darn cold. And so in about 6 years ago, my colleague Christine Lane, who works on cryptotephras, managed to find the Toba tephra in the drill core of Lake Malawi. In fact, she found it in both sites. And so this was it was a big deal when we found it, because of the distance away from the Toba eruption. But then the other part of it was, here it is, right, this YTT, Younger Toba tephra, and here's the Tex 86 temperature record, and you can see that it's a big nothing sandwich of climate change. Not much happens. In fact, there's this big excursion in temperature in the opposite direction just previously, but this paper was published, and immediately the anthropologists who were really clinging to this idea said, well, you know, this record is only resolved at kind of century to millennial scale, so you know, you're not really telling us anything. The entire event could be subsumed in between two of these samples. And at that point, my ears went up. I said, well, we can do better than this. We can get in there and look at the ecological responses that you would expect the lake to experience on an annual basis, because we have these near annual, if not annual, levels of varving in the lake. So if you take a lake that is meromictic in the tropics and you mix it by dropping the temperature 5 or 6 degrees, as the climate modelers were proposing happen, you would create a huge ecological change in that lake. You'd have this deep mixing, you might ventilate the bottom waters and have benthic invertebrates. You would have all kinds of algal responses in terms of that mixing. You would expect on the landscape vegetation changes and a lot of fire, and basically a huge ecological reorganization. So we went in there and sampled at 3 millimeter intervals. The diatomists who worked on the project, Jeff Stone, he actually wanted to do it at finer, like 1 millimeter increments, which we could have done for the diatoms. We couldn't really do it for the other things. But here's the tephra, and again, a big nothing burger. There's really very little that happens. There is some evidence in one of the drill core sites of some fire. So it does seem that Toba did a little bit of damage, but to these early modern humans walking around in the landscape, maybe you know, a dusting in their hair or something of ash coming out of the sky, probably not something that would have knocked out human populations. So taking advantage really of this high resolution type of record, but going back much further in time. I mentioned before that we can use these records to understand evolutionary events. The African lakes have huge numbers of endemic species. The big purple circles here are the numbers of endemic cichlid fish, the beautiful ones that you see in pet stores. But there's also endemic invertebrates of various kinds in the lake. And we've been interested in understanding these lakes. In part, it's been done from molecular genetics, molecular clock data, but increasingly we think we can tie in these events to the environmental histories that we can get out of them from the drill cores. So Malawi, I mentioned earlier, Malawi and Tanganyika are very similar in shape. Malawi's much shallower. It's only about 700 or 8 meters deep, and Tanganyika is double that. But one of the really interesting and problematic things before we got into this project was we knew from the geological evidence that this lake is about 5 or 6 million years old, and yet the molecular clock data was all pointing to the cichlid radiation as in probably the most diverse fish radiation on Earth. There might be 1,000 species of these things. It only dates to about 800,000 years ago, and this was kind of puzzling. We didn't really understand this. And I'm just going to take you through some of the reasoning here now that we've been able to work out, going through these blue lake, green lake fluctuations that we see but also adding another twist to it. So if you look, there is actually a pretty good precessional signal embedded in here, and precessional eccentricity modulated precessional signal in especially these 400,000 year cycles in here. We think that these lakes have different thresholds of insulation required for them to overflow. And early on, it seems there's a lot of evidence that the lake was relatively fresh early on, and yet it was also shallow, which is not something you could maintain in that basin today. If it gets shallow, you end up with one of those alkaline mud puddles that I showed you before. So we think that early in its history, the lake probably had a very different outlet level. Very different hydrology, and it is a tectonically controlled basin. So I say this to make the point that it's not all climate that's driving this. It is in part tectonics when you start dealing with these long-lived lakes. So about 800,000 years ago, there's a major watershed outlet reconfiguration, and these deep lake cycles take over from this high frequency variability that probably was actually a relatively shallow basin. And that set in motion the possibility of making a deep lake when the climate was wet. And so you go back and forth between these blue lake phases when everybody can see each other. There's a lot of speciation going on of these cichlid fishes, big bursts of habitat variability on these rocky habitats, and the formation of species flocks here, marked by these little triangle bursts of radiation in the species. And then a green lake phase comes along, you got a lot of variability, and boom, these things go extinct. But they don't all go extinct. What they actually do is many of them are actually hybridizing, because they are visual mate recognizers. So they actually can find and identify mates. And we know this from Lake Victoria, which has undergone cultural eutrophication, that the species began massive hybridization in this turbid green lake situation. So we think that may have been what happened. And in fact, the molecular clock data all points to an initial burst of radiation right at the time when we see the first one of these deep lake phases, and then extinction following that. So these shallow rock-dwelling, what they call Mbuna species, are hybridizing with deeper water species. And then feeding morphologies, there was also documented from the molecular clock data an event around 400,000 years ago. Again, they didn't know why. Well, it's another one of these extended blue lake phases for almost 100,000 years. More aborted diversifications and extinctions, and then the most recent phase of diversification, again documented completely independently by the molecular clock data 75,000 years ago, and it maps directly onto the most recent period when the lake has been like this. So we think that there's a pretty good context for understanding these adaptive radiations. So let me jump now to talk about another application to evolution and paleoecology, but this one project that's ongoing now that I direct, the Hominin sites and Paleolakes drilling project. And as the name implies, the project is really directed towards collecting old lake beds, now from outcrops. We decided we'd try something that's a little bit easier than building the Jordy's resolution. So where we could actually drive a drill rig up to an outcrop and get nice, fresh samples from lake beds that are in close proximity to important fossil paleoanthropological sites. And as I'm sure you all know, Africa, for the first 4 million years of hominin, our own clade history, going back to 6 million years and then branching from African great apes, it was an exclusively African story up to about 2 million years ago. So we've known for a long time from deep sea core records and soil isotopes that Africa was undergoing over the last 5 million years or so long-term erodification, but we didn't really know the details of this The drill cores from offshore are highly spatially averaged. So the work that Peter Domenical and my colleague Jess Tierney and others have done, documenting from leaf wax records or other dust records, give us a picture of a long-term change. Similarly, soil carbonate soil isotope records also give us a picture. But we wanted to flesh that out in the basins where the hominins were being found. And the justification for this is that if you look at the paleoanthropological literature, almost every event in human hominin prehistory has at some time or another been potentially or putatively linked to climate events, or at least environmental change. Those hypotheses, I'm not going to get into the details of them, but they can be sort of boiled down into three possibilities. One is that events, evolutionary events, and including their dispersal or extinction events, might occur within the context of very stable habitats, or they might occur within the context of aggressive environmental change, or they might have occurred in the context of more variable habitats with the mean state remaining the same. And of course, there's the null hypothesis that human evolution has nothing to do with climate. It might be Red Queen or some other biological interactions. The point is that we as paleolimnologists and paleoclimatologists can't really say much about the anthropology side of this, but we can say a lot about the environmental history that they're trying to tie into. So the point of our project was really to do a couple things: to collect continuous lake cores in the basins where the records were coming from that encompass these important intervals of human prehistory, and to get these kind of high resolution, in fact I have centennial, but even down to decadal level climate and paleoenvironmental records through those events, and then to test those hypotheses about does it make sense in light of these changes and when we know the evolutionary events in the hominins were occurring. So we can do that, and we've collected now, between 2012 and 2014, we collected a whole series of drill cores. We collected about 2 kilometers of core, and we're slowly working our way through all of these. On the bottom here, you can see the locations up and down the Rift Valley from Ethiopia down to southern Kenya. And these red bars indicate the ages that are spanned by these. So our idea was not to make one master record continuous. That's kind of the next phase of thinking, but rather to encompass these critical intervals and to really think about these events as historical experiments. Are there uniquely similar climate types of events that occur associated with each of these phases of evolution? So I don't have time to go into the details, but the major finding so far is that we've got some continuous records through the Pleistocene transition in continental African tropics, including some of the first records that will be published soon on the climate shift associated with the onset of northern hemisphere glaciation. Spoiler alert, it changes before ice. Really interesting. And it becomes drier and more variable, and that's evident in 2 of our sites, so that's pretty exciting. I have possibly a DNA site, but it's actually now we know in 2 records there. We see extreme variability of precessional and even sub-precessional timescales in the lakes and climates. I'll show you a little bit of evidence there. It challenges some of our modeling landscape response assumptions, and this is evident in all of our drill sites. And for the last 500,000 years, we've seen strong erodification in a couple of sites, and that's still under study in the 3rd site. But this is really going to be pretty important in terms of understanding the context of out of Africa and the evolution of modern Homo sapiens. So just to show you a couple of outcrop and core pictures. We already knew in the central Kenyan BTB site that there was these nice alternating diatomite shallow lake cycles. These we now know are precessional, and beautiful cores came out of this. Not all of it lacustrine, some of it is alluvial channel, some of it is heavily bioturbated, but a lot of lake beds, which makes everybody very happy. Okay. There we go. And this is the really interesting event I was mentioning a minute ago. We see this in a lot of different records now, in the physical properties records, in the scanning XRF records, in the mineralogy, and increasingly now in the paleoecology. A big change around 3 million. So it predates onset of Northern Hemisphere ice, although, you know, arguably there are interesting things going on in the North Atlantic that time. But this is going to be a major focus for research in the future. It is one of the things that's really interesting about it is that when you do the wavelet analyses on these records, this has a really strong obliquity signal when this kicks in. And that's not something you expect to see at the equator. So it does suggest the teleconnection to higher latitudes. The Northern Awash site, which also spans this time interval, this is the famous Lucy fossil, Australopithecus afarensis, which is literally stone's throw away from our drill site. And this also has some interesting a major transition about the same time from these deep water laminated dark green clays into a much more variable, fluctuating and drier system in the upper part. Some of this work was done by Joe as part of his master's thesis, but we see a major transition from the lower part of the record into a really interesting and highly variable lake system in the upper portion. So prior to, it's a little earlier here, it's around 3.15, we've got this relatively stable deep lake, and it starts to fluctuate a lot after that with a lot of exposure. And people are doing high resolution studies on these now. Here's just a taste of this, a transition in the paleoecological indicators. This is just a semi-quantitative measure of these cores. They haven't been counted yet in detail. But again, this transition in two sites from deep lake wet conditions to highly variable dry conditions. And the organic geochemistry is also changing, shifting right at the same point. The bulk organic matter, C13, and the bulk nitrogen show this same transition. The Turkana site, this is Turkana Boy, the near complete Homo erectus fossil, or Homo ergaster, an early archaic Homo that was the first one that had a stature like us. You know, if you'd seen one walking down the street, you wouldn't be shocked. And so somebody that size can handle a large tool. It wasn't the first tool maker, stone tool maker, but it made these ubiquitous Acheulean hand axes that you'd have to be pretty strong to manipulate something like that. So our drill site here on the west side of Lake Turkana is just a short distance away from that, where the Turkana Boy was found. And again, we see alternations of the same suite of rocks from lake beds, laminated lake beds, to sometimes paleosols, back and forth on sub-precessional timescales. So this is also something that's interesting that's coming out. We're seeing this more and more, these 5K, as well as half precession, which we sort of expected, but even these quarter precessional types of beats. And just to, if you weren't convinced already, I like this picture. So there's an outcrop view. You can go and look at the outcrops, and you can see the paleosol horizons in here and the lake beds. But it's all typical lacustrine outcrop, looks like crap. And then here's the core from the same place, and the detail that you can see of these events. So here's a deep lake phase, desiccation, carbonate nodules, and a paleosol surface horizon, and then boom, back into deep lake laminated. Another one of these right above this. So you can really start to query these things on a very much tighter time scale going back in time. The Magadi site, this is an active basin today in southern Kenya. And we actually have two locations here and near Bolga-Sili, an important archaeological site north of there, spanning the last million years. And nice age models now developing on both of these sites. And pretty good evidence, this has now been submitted for both from the pollen, so from the watershed, as well as from the diatom and the geochemistry for a major transition around 350 to 500,000 years ago towards much drier conditions in this basin. And what's interesting about that from a paleoanthro point of view is this is just recently in Nature, a whole series of papers came out by our anthropologists and archaeology colleagues. They have documented from this area the transition from the early Stone Age hand axe technology into the Middle Stone Age in this area in continuous stratigraphy, and it spans the same period of time when conditions are getting drier. So I like to push this in the face of my colleague Rick Potts, because he's the guy behind the environmental variability hypothesis. And it's, well, it's actually getting drier, Rick, so I don't know. We're going to have to reevaluate that idea given these new findings. So just to finish up, as you can see, I'm not too excited about lake deposits in Africa. So, but I'm hoping that in my career and lifetime I get to be involved in one more. And this is going to be a pretty ambitious thing to drill Lake Tanganyika, the deepest of the Rift Lakes, 1.5 kilometers deep in its deepest part. And although we don't want to drill in that kind of water depth, we think we've identified some really fantastic places where, unlike Malawi, because this lake is so deep, you can drop lake level 700 meters and still have an 800-meter deep lake. So it doesn't appear to have dried out, and that probably explains the fact that when you look at the phylogenies of not just the cichlid fish, but the invertebrates, they're much more deeply rooted. They go back the full 7 or 8 or 10 million years to the origin of this lake. It hasn't dried out and gone away. The ecosystem hasn't been completely converted into something utterly different. So we see endemic everything there, from these deeply rooted cichlid fish. Here's different tribes, endemic tribes, not just species. Here's the Malawi and Victoria flocks, and you can see these radiations are much more recent because of the more rapid and more profound environmental variability than in this lake. But it's got endemic mollusks, crazy marine-looking things, crazy marine-looking ostracods, and the preservation of the fossils is in these deep lake deposits is remarkable. So this is an insect. If you've ever seen one of these Green River fossils, lake beds, you know, this is what we're dealing with. Fossils where you can find the integument, the muscle tissues. So potential is here for doing some really cool ancient DNA work in these anoxic lake sediments and melding together the phylogenetics and the morphology to answer, you know, critical questions about evolution and adaptive radiation. And of course, getting a continuous paleoclimate record from one place for Africa going back 5 or 10 million years would be phenomenal. So just to summarize here, I think these paleo records from these drill cores provide us with a lot of insights into and they're outside the range of recent variability, but who knows for the future. I think that, you know, these hydrological changes of lake levels dropping hundreds of meters has to be something that lake managers take into account. The sensitivity, you know, even though these lakes may be hydrologically open, they lose 90% of their water to evaporation, and they're right on the tipping edge. So it doesn't take much to cause them to decline very rapidly. That Malawi mega drought record with its repeated fluctuations between those blue and green lake states, and going on in timescales, the transitions from decades to centuries where it flips. And you know, telling us something about human demography and evolution, including maybe knocking down a few chestnuts. And I think that they're providing us with a context for understanding these incredible African lake flocks. Climate is important, but tectonics is also important in a lake that sticks around that long. And Tanganyika eventually could provide us with a way to tie together evolutionary biologists and paleo and climatologists, and answering, you know, a lot of really interesting, cool questions into the future. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer questions. Yes.
Why was the last 100,000 years spike? Why was that drier than most of the other periodicities on the 100,000 year cycle?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah, really, it does stand out relative to the earlier ones, but I think that you have to keep in mind that these paleoecological records, as well as the geochemical records, are clipped on both the wet and the dry end. It can only, you know, it can only dry up so to the point where the lake gets to form a paleosol. But a lot of those things where it approaches those conditions, and then of course we don't know how much more it dropped below that, and we don't, when you get back more than a couple 100,000 years, we don't know the total basin configuration either. But those are the ones that we have clear evidence of exposure. And there are plenty of those earlier ones where it's kind of orangey that don't go to full exposure, but where you can see that it's clearly littoral. So it can't be more than a few tens of meters deep. So on the magnitude of a 600-meter lake level fluctuation, you're seeing in the principal components analysis, you're seeing a big difference because you're seeing dry versus a little bit of water. But from a climatological point of view, you know, 10 or 20 meters relative to the 600-meter span is really not that great. So, you know, I don't know, you know, why fundamentally the last one was so big. Yeah.
Can you say there's no match for the conditions you would expect for the 5 to 6 degree cooling from Toba in the core? But that cooling is an air temperature cooling in the model, so how does that fit with lake temperature cooling?
Yeah, so if you had sustained air temperatures of that magnitude, you know, the seasonal cycle in Malawi is a couple of degrees, so it's not negligible. But you would overturn that lake with that kind of sustained cooling. You would cool the surface waters to the point where they would mix, and we just see no evidence for that. So it's not to say that there wasn't any cooling at all. We do see in the phytolith records from the highlands, we do see a little bit of charring at that horizon, and some evidence from the types of phytoliths that it might have been a little bit cooler. But what's important to note there is that the variability associated with that is less than, because we looked at this for a couple hundred years before and a couple hundred years after. And so when you compare it with the background variability, there are events both before and after that are larger magnitude than that. So I wouldn't say there was nothing happened, but it's nothing out of the ordinary for that few hundred-year time span. Whereas, you know, the Toba hypothesis as an impactor of human evolution would have to be a really profound event. The other thing I would say is that my grad student, Chad Yost, who just had a paper on this in Journal of Human Evolution, went back and looked at the model assumptions, and particularly the sulfate load assumptions that have driven a lot of the modeling work on Toba. And it turns out that the sulfate loads that were used relative to the actual measurements are probably a couple orders of magnitude too high. So right there's a fundamental flaw in the reasoning. But it's very difficult to get and there are a lot of people that are very wedded to this idea. And so, time will tell whether the Toba ash, by the way, just recently was found in an archaeological site in South Africa. There's no evidence for any significant change in human occupation before and after. Yeah.
Are there seismic in these records? Like, can you get a paleoseismic record from all the different lakes that you record?
Yeah, in fact, nobody fund you to drill if you didn't have a good seismic record. So yeah, the seismics in the Rift Lakes were actually an outcome. When I was a graduate student, I was fortunate enough to be invited by a couple of people to a workshop at NSF. This was in 1980, talk about drilling the African Great Lakes. And one of the outcomes of that was a guy at Duke University named Bruce Rosendahl first pitched it to NSF, and he was a young assistant professor. They didn't believe he could pull it off. So he went to the oil companies and said, hey, give me $10 million. And he did. And he went out and did a seismic survey. It was called Project Probe. And a lot of our initial understanding from multifold seismics were based on those initial studies. In fact, we've known about that unconformity in very low resolution in Malawi. You can go back and look at a cover of Geology from 1990 that shows that. We had no idea when it happened, but we knew that's a signal of low lake stand. So the seismics are absolutely integral, and not just for siting, because they're critical for that. You don't want to fall, you want to avoid gas. Any kind of hydrocarbons, not good. But also for having that regional context and mapping out what is the bathymetry, what is the water depth at various times. So you can look at the planiforms and see where the deltas are. My colleague Chris Schultz at Syracuse University has been kind of spearheading all of that work. There's another. Oh, yes.
But noting how far back that went, the last major Yellowstone eruption was, what, 630,000 years ago? Did you look to see if there was any indication of anything at that point?
Wow. That's,
Well, that was a mega
don't
eruption.
know if,
Toba, I think. Or more.
yeah, no, that you're right. The 700,000, whatever it is. 630, yeah.
630.
No, I mean, Christine Lane, who's been spearheading the cryptotepher work, she was originally and continues to be very fixed on trying to identify Toba because it is such a good marker. But she's been looking for other tephras from around Africa. But as far as I know, she has not specifically looked for that. These cryptotepher studies are difficult because you're just pulling out a few shards of glass, but no, that's a great idea.
It's a long way back.
Yeah, but it's a huge eruption, so yeah, maybe it's there. Yes.
So the paleosols that you were showing in the core, do you get a sense of the pedogenic pathways of those sols? Are they iridosols or
well, they're full of carbonate nodules. I'm not a paleosol guy, but they're also associated with marginal lake swampy types of environments. So there's something that is forming not too far from the shoreline, but beyond that, I don't know. We haven't had anybody really dig into them. It could be done, but we just haven't had it.
I'll tell you something about environmental conditions.
Yeah.
You can
Yes.
tweak out the morphological.
We had originally hoped that we would be able to also get a U-series date on some of those nodules, but it hasn't panned out. Dating that Malawi core has been a challenge. Okay, well, thank you again.
No, she traded.
Roger, nice to meet you. Yeah, Gail. Inspiration. I mean,